it's not part of the,
Okay.
but it's just between us. يعني ماشي من la conférence. غير باش ما كاين مشكل. C'est rien qu'entre nous. قبل ما نبداو. Parce qu'on a encore 2 minutes. I just bought a book. It's one of these books that, you know, I tell my son, like, read this, read this. I feel I'm like my father who used to tell me, like, read this, read this, read this. And I never read it because my father told me to read it, no? And then you read it 10 years later, and I'm like, why didn't I read it before? Anyway, this is a book that was published quite recently. You can pass it around. It's called Destiny Disrupted. It's written by Tamim Ansari. He's Afghan British. And actually, he's a descendant of Ansari, the poet, if you've ever heard of him. It's called Destiny Disrupted, and it's a history of the world through Islamic eyes. It's very well done in the sense it's not trying to justify things, but all he does is, instead of having the focus Europe and then what is happening, the focus is here. Okay, and for me it was fascinating to read. A lot of the stuff we know it, but we never saw it that way. Okay, and so I thought it might be interesting, no? So read up with you, and you can read the back. It's what I loved about this book. It's very well written. Like, you read it and you want to read more. You know, it's not a heavy history book. It's really nice to read. So anyway, that's just. I don't have this in PDF though, but the other one I do. Okay. Yalla. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah. So today is our last day, and it's just the morning. We have the pleasure again of welcoming Professor Reinhart. I guess this session you will be talking, right, Professor? And then there might be general comment, questions after that. And we're supposed to finish at 11 o'clock, just so that you know the time frame.
11 o'clock, خلاص?
My understanding is that. صح?
Yeah, we finished at 11. News to me, okay.
Okay. Professor.
Then I better get going. Good morning. It's nice to see you for our concluding session, although I'm sorry that, in fact, the sessions are concluding. The slide that's on the screen right now is my email. I'm hoping that I'll be getting copies of your emails and descriptions of what it is that you do and all of that. I'm happy to continue the conversations that we've started here, and I hope you'll consider engaging with this wonderful thing that has in many ways diminished the isolation of scholars one from another in the modern world. So there it is. Please don't sell that to people who are, I don't know what, telling you where to buy a car or something like that. But by all means, I would look forward to hearing from you. So anybody who wants to write that down got it? Is that clear? All right. So today I want to finish off with what I consider is the third conceptual aspect when we're trying to understand what is Islam, and that is cosmopolitan Islam, which is also sometimes called standard Islam or official Islam. And I want to say this, that this in some ways is the Islam of textbooks. This is the Islam that when you take a high school course in Islam, or you take a college course on Islam, or when you take an introduction to Islam in an American university, this is the kind of Islam that they teach. And in that sense, it's the standard Islam, which is like standard English, right? We don't teach you how to say something like, when you mean to say, I'm in the process of beginning to work on my paper, we don't teach you in an English class to say, I'm fixin' to work on my paper, which in certain parts of America is a perfectly useful tense. It's a future optative for those of you who are interested. And in certain regions of America, it's widespread. But we don't teach that in English classes, right? Because it's not standard English. But the thing to recognize is that nobody speaks standard English. I cannot speak English in such a way that you would not know about me, where I'm from, perhaps, what kind of background I have, and so on and so forth. And that's, in some ways, the point of standard Islam, as we'll see. It is the Islam that tries to efface particularity. Now, I also call it official Islam because it is often the Islam that's backed by the state. Historically, even in Morocco, states have not directly determined what constituted correct Islamic behavior at the individual level, but particularly in the modern world, the Islam that we're talking about is promulgated by the state through ministries and through textbooks and through patronage of certain ulama and neglect of other ulama and even the suppression of ulama. So this Islam is, as I say, is official, but I prefer to focus on its cosmopolitan features because, again, I consider the outstanding achievement, one of the outstanding achievements of Islam is creating a, world embracing community of scholars so that you could have a scholar who goes from Morocco and becomes a faqih in India. And there's no parallel for this anywhere that I know of in any other religious tradition before the modern period. Now, the Islam of nowhere and never is what I will talk about as well, and that is the idea of cosmopolitan Islam as something that is not locally inflected. And we can see this in certain writings of the ulama. Okay, so those are the terms. Before we begin, I think it's useful to understand certain features about religion in general and that apply across the board to most religions, including Islam, in my view. The Latin term is used here because we want to signify that that it is a technical term, and that is the concept of illud tempus or in illo tempore. The important Romanian historian of religion who was based in France and then at the University of Chicago, he pointed out that most religions look back to some time when things began. And that is seen as somehow a time in which the religious tradition or religion was somehow perfect because it was the time of the founder. And there's a way in which many religions try to, in one way or another, return to that time through ritual, through various other kinds of practices, because it's seen as the spring from which the tradition comes. So for Protestants, the Protestant Reformation, the goal was to try and live like the apostles, the people who were around Jesus at his time, and to create a community that was like that time. In Judaism, for example, in ritual, the ritual of Passover is a commemoration in which you are actually made present, in some sense, of the time of the Exodus from Egypt, when God protected the people of Israel as they went as they left Egypt on their way to the land of Israel. So this is a feature that you'll find in almost all religions, and it is, of course, true in Islam with the generation of the Salaf, right? The first generation. Within a few decades of the Prophet's death, we find the notion that the best generation is the first generation, and the next best generation is the second generation. and the third generation is after that, and then you have the later description of it is fasad zaman, right? And this is a well-known concept that is part of all versions of Islam that I know of, even especially including Shiism, but it's found in all of the madhahib that I know of. So the argument that the action of the Salaf is formative, that it makes that to follow the acts of the Salaf is foundational, is the Islamic equivalent of this notion of illud tempus. The interesting thing is that in living in the manner of the first generation, we move away from, we in some ways remove ourselves from this world in which we live. And this is an important feature of religious life. It takes us out of the kind of imperfection of our world and allows us to live in a more perfect world, at least in our imaginations. This involves the use of myth. Now, here's a good example of a term that I'm sure some of you will object to. But again, it's a technical term in the study of religion. A myth is not necessarily true or false. A myth is a foundational story. It's a story that provides information about this tradition that's generated, and it may be historically true, or it may be historically not true. So for example, the example that I always use at home, and perhaps you'll be slightly familiar with it, is in what we call American civil religion. One of the foundational figures is George Washington. So here is a myth about George Washington that was taught into my father's generation. When he was a boy, he got a new axe, and he went out with this axe, and to test it, he chopped down a cherry tree. And this was his father's cherry tree. And when his father saw the cherry tree cut down, he was really angry, and he went around the house saying, "Who cut down my cherry tree?" And George Washington said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It is I who chopped down the cherry tree." Okay, that's one myth. A second myth about George Washington is that after he was elected as president the second time, people came to him and said, "You know, you have helped found the country, you're the father of our country, we want to make you king." And he said, "No, this is a democracy, we don't have a king." And they said, "Then let's give you another term of office, and as many terms of office as you want." And he said, "No, I want to return to my farm, and it's not a good idea to have somebody ruling for more than 8 years." Okay, those are two myths about George Washington, and they're taught in schools, and they're very important to the way we think about ourselves. We changed the Constitution, for example, so that you can only have 2 terms as president. Now, the first story is not true. It was invented by a man called Parson Weems, and we can trace the history of it, and it's no longer taught because it's simply not true. It didn't happen in the historical sense. The second is a very important myth, and it did happen. It's completely true. People offered to make George Washington king, and they offered to have him stay in office as long as he wanted. And he said, "No, that's not a good idea." Okay? But both are founding myths. They're important myths that were taught to school children to help them understand, A, how great George Washington was, and B, how they themselves should think about their life conduct. Right? That democracy requires restraint, and it requires truthfulness. Okay? So the use of the term myth, then, does not mean falsehood. Of course, in the vulgar sense, in ordinary conversation, we say, "Oh, that's a myth," meaning that's not true. But again, this is not how we use the term in the study of religion. So it should be obvious to you then that the foundational stories about the Prophet, about the companions, about the followers of the companions. Those are foundational stories that guide Muslims, both in a formal sense, in books of hadith and so on and so forth, but also, again, in an informal sense, in telling anecdotes about Umar ibn al-Khattab or about Imam Ali or the Caliph Ali and the Caliph Abu Bakr and so on and so forth. So the custodians of these myths, the people who teach them in the official way, are the people that we call the ulama. So the ulama are people who are the custodians of, who are responsible for what we call ilm. Again, this audience, I don't have to tell you that ilm is not just anything. It's not knowledge of physics. It's not knowledge of falsafa. It's not logic of. It's not any of the other forms of knowledge. It is a particular set of knowledge, which is knowledge of revelation, and knowledge of how the means by which, the person by which revelation came. Now, this knowledge, as it developed over time, had a couple of really interesting features. First of all, although Muslims were a minority everywhere, it was conveyed in the language of the first community, that is to say, in Arabic. And it's not surprising that in order to really master Arabic, people developed grammars and so on and so forth. But the people who did that were Persians, like Sibawayh, for example. He was a Persian speaker. But he mastered Arabic so that he could participate in this culture of ilm, and he wrote a grammar, and it's one of the first and most important grammars of Arabic. Because if you wanted to do ilm, if you want to participate in the culture of ilm, you had to know Arabic. The power of this is that if you knew Arabic, you could participate in this culture whether you were Amazigh, or as they would have said then, a Berber living in Morocco, or if you were a Copt living in Egypt, or if you were a Zoroastrian originally, a Persian, living in Iran, or living in what we would now call Afghanistan. So it is ilm that creates the cosmopolitan community of scholars that ultimately, in theory, says, doesn't matter where you're from, you can be a scholar in this tradition so long as you have the basic information, the basic knowledge, the knowledge of Arabic, that you've studied, usually memorized the Quran, that you're familiar with the works of other scholars, let's say Mufassirin, and that you know the information about the Prophet, and particularly the skills that are connected to hadith and usul hadith, right? And then the method by which those are applied in practical life through fiqh and the theory of fiqh, which is usul fiqh. So this is the content of ilm, but it's the content of this cosmopolitan Islam. And you can see now why I call it cosmopolitan. Because in a sense, it's at home wherever it goes. Not only is a scholar in Afghanistan or in India able to participate, and there were many fine scholars in India who did participate in the development of the Islamic sciences, but a scholar from India could go to the Ottoman Empire and get a job and be taken seriously because he was a master of these sciences. Similarly, our friend Ibn Battuta goes from Morocco, where he's probably a middle-level scholar, no great thing, but he goes all the way to India, and he's appointed the chief mufti of Delhi, or actually in this case the chief judge in Delhi, even though he's a Maliki and the madhab in India is the Hanafis, right? Even though he doesn't speak the local language, right? Nonetheless, they give him an interpreter. He has a prestige because he has come from far away and because he's perceived as knowing the ilm of Islam. So that's why I use the term cosmopolitan. So the principles of cosmopolitan Islam, or the outcome of it, you might say, is first of all that the source of relevant knowledge, and again, no one denied that mathematics was important, no one denied that logic was important, or even things like meteorology and geology and so on. It's just not what these kind of scholars did, not what the ulama did. It's grounded in ilm. And that ilm is in Arabic, right? It is not the native language necessarily. It's not the native language of most Muslims, but it becomes your native language when you train yourself or are trained in ilm, right? And so when you know this, you're an alim and you convey the ilm and you share in its prestige and its power, right? So when you learn all of the sciences, then you're in a position to have opinions about people's religious conduct, and frequently this means that you can get a job, a good job, as a qadi or as a mufti or as a teacher in a madrasa. So this is a particular kind of knowledge and culture that floats above, you might say, the day-to-day life in, let's say, Iran in the 11th century, when most people speak Persian at home, right? And there are a whole series of Persian customs that people are probably practicing. We know that they were in Egypt anyway, and they were in Syria. And nonetheless, you are floating above that as an alim. So the sources of this information are the sources that many of us are familiar with, at least in theory, not just the scriptural sources, but all of the tools that go with them, right? So it's not just hadith and the Quran itself, but it is the rules for interpreting that. So the grammars, nahu and nahu, and lexicography, so dictionaries and so on, so that you know what rare words mean if you're reading them in the Sunnah or in the Quran. And then the theoretical works that were developed in the Islamic 300s, like usul al-fiqh and so on, to help you understand the meta level, the highest level, the most abstract level of what's going on in fiqh. Now, all of this provides a certain orientation in time and space, and it's that I want to talk about right now. Because, as I say, the business of cosmopolitan Islam is to float above the everyday world in which Muslims were located with all of its particularities, right? It is to create or live in or be guided by a world that is not the world of, Tuesday, 1100 Hijri in, let's say, Antep in the Ottoman Empire, right? It is, right, something else again. So first of all, in this world that's created, you have sharp lines of distinction, and these are much more important in cosmopolitan Islam than in dialect Islam. For instance, the distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims. Right? In theory, and you can see this particularly in scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, Muslims and non-Muslims should not associate. Right? Drawing on I think, tenuously understood passage in the Quran. The idea is that Muslims and non-Muslims should live distinct lives. We know that that was almost never the case, right? Even in situations in which, for example, Jews were confined to a certain space, right, Mallah, nonetheless, there was constant conversation back and forth. People attended each other's festivals, and sometimes there were exchanges across marriage lines in ways that were complicated, and so on and so forth. There were blendings of religious practice. As I said in the first lecture, Muslims went to Jewish saints' tombs and Jews went to Muslim saints' tombs. And we know that there were also debates, right? That sometimes Jews and Muslims in formal contexts or Muslims and Christians in formal contexts would be asked to debate some particular issue in front of a merchant or a scholar or especially a ruler. And these were seen as part of the process. They were not a threat. You weren't debating because you're going to convert the Christian or because the Christian's going to convert the Muslim. It was to expose people to high-level arguments and inform them of how their tradition can be described as well. Similarly, we see sharp lines of distinction between the sexes. Right? Now, I'm going to use this term now. It's a laden term. But it's also a technical term. The view that women are dangerous, that they somehow, contaminate men, and that they have a dangerous nature. The technical term for that in the academy is misogyny. And the striking thing to me is the distinction, and this leads to certain historical conclusions, between the misogyny in the Quran, which basically there isn't, and the misogyny in the Hadith, which there's a lot of. And so the appeal of people trying to keep men and women from associating with each other is almost always to the Sunnah, right? But in any case, the Cosmopolitan Islam is all about distinctions, and one of them is between the sexes, and that's supposed to be maintained and supported. Similarly, Cosmopolitan Islam is defined by self-control, right? And that means particularly limited emotion. So again, in theory, funerals are not to be attended by women because women are emotional. But even men who go are not supposed to weep and wail and all of that stuff. You're supposed to be contained, right? It is as I say, self-control is highly valued, and emotion is seen as a kind of loss of control. So these are all things that cosmopolitans value. And it's expressed in ritual and ritualization, right? Particularly, as I say, in funerals, but in other contexts as well. Salat is a very dignified and constrained act, right? It's not, there's not a lot of, hand waving and weeping or, yelling or whatever. It's done in a very calm, controlled way. Now, when we look at this, what we realize is that this is an aspect of religion that is highly valued, but it is not necessarily what actually people did. Does not reflect what Muslims did. It is not. There's a kind of Orientalism where they say, well, if you want to understand relations between fathers and daughters in Syria, look at the fiqh books. But that's not a good place to look. And in fact, it's the experts in fiqh who teach us this. So if you look at, for example, a Maliki called Ibn al-Hajj, or if you look at, of course, Ibn Taymiyyah, they spend a lot of time. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote a whole book called Kitab al-Iqtida to reproach Muslims for all of the things that are contrary to cosmopolitan Islam. And you can see the ideal in what he prescribes, even though it's completely unrealistic. So, for instance, Ibn Taymiyyah says, it is shameful and reprehensible, it is makruh for a Muslim to speak any language other than Arabic, right? And he's saying this in Syria, where probably the majority speakers are still speaking Aramaic or Syriac, which is sort of the same language, right? We know that a majority of Muslims is not really reached in the Middle East, the area we call the Middle East, until sometime in the mid-1200s into the 1300s, right? And we assume that, and we know from travelers' accounts, that other languages were used. And yet Ibn Taymiyyah says, no, this is wrong, you should only speak Arabic. All Muslims always should speak Arabic, only Arabic. Now, what this tells us, of course, is that people weren't speaking Arabic. Similarly, he tells us that Muslims should not decorate their houses the way that the Christians do at Easter. That tells us that Muslims were decorating their houses the way the Christians do at Easter, right? And so on. Muslims should not go to saints' shrines and ask for miracles. Again, this tells us that they were, right? They shouldn't do the wukuf Arafah, in Jerusalem or in Damascus, and that tells us that people were doing the wukuf during the Hajj season in Jerusalem and in Damascus. So the point is that Ibn Taymiyyah visualizes Muslims not belonging to the place that they actually live, right? This is what I mean by the Islam of nowhere. The place that Muslims belong, there are only 3 places that are remarkable in the world, and all the rest of it is homogeneous and doesn't count. And those 3 places are Mecca, Medina, and for Ibn Taymiyyah, he's quite suspicious, but he has to concede Jerusalem too. Those are the 3 places. And every place else is the same, and every place else is unimportant. So the tradition in, let's say, dialect Islam that makes some local places important because a saint was there, much less because there's a rock there, a special rock there, or a tree there, or a spring there, or whatever, that is completely, that's local. That makes some local place important. And no place is important except for those 3 places, right? Now, you can say, and people have said this, well, Ibn Taymiyyah is an extremist. Right, but he is the extreme realization of the logic of cosmopolitan Islam. And we can see in his extremism both what the theory is and how far that was from the practice. So no local sites matter, as I say, Mecca, then Medina, then Jerusalem, but it's also the Islam of no time, right? There's nothing about the time in which we live that is notable, right? Not the particularities of language, right? But also not the particularities of, let's say, practice. The fact that all of us in Syria celebrate a wedding this way or that way means nothing, right? You should look and see what the ilm says about marriages, and it says nothing about a marriage ritual. There's nothing about a marriage ritual. It's simply that you write a contract and you make the exchanges that are required by that contract, and the woman moves into the house. Right? So this is what I mean by one is living in illud tempus, in the time and the place, in some mythical way, of the first generation of Muslims. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a kind of implicit ideal. You can only see it in a few really kind of hardcore alim critics, as I say, like Ibn al-Hajj or like Ibn Taymiyyah, and there are a handful of people that we sort of can look at and see this information. But when we're sort of analyzing, looking at the different organs, you might say, of Islam, of lived Islam, Islam as it is in the world, the cosmopolitan Islam, taken as an ideal by itself, this is how it seems to work, right? And of course, it's the Islam of no one. That is to say, ethnicity and other groups don't signify. So, the fact that you're a Kurd or a Turk or a Amazigh or an Arab, none of those things in theory in theory matter. And also, this is very much an Islam of men. Right? Now, of course, no one lives like this, as I said, but there are important consequences to the privileging these sorts of sources and this sort of ideal. The positive is that, as I say, it creates a medium of cultural exchange that until the modern period was unparalleled. There were scholars from Morocco functioning in India, but that, more importantly, to be in Morocco or to be in Tunis meant no religious distinction in theory, right? And there's this constant circulation, right, of scholars throughout Islamdom. There's no parallel that I know of except a brief period in China in the 8th and 9th centuries where Chinese went to India to try and learn about Buddhism, which was disappearing from India. But that's the only parallel that I can think of. So this is, as I say, an amazing achievement, and it helps to knit Muslims together. Most of the travel, of course, there's travel by merchants and so on and so forth, but at the ideological level, most of the travel was by the ulama, and they exchanged ideas with each other, but also, and this is important, they felt qualified to police the Islam in places other than their own. So there is a long history of people going away and coming back, or coming from the outside and looking around and seeing dialect practices and saying, no, that's too far. That's not compatible with your being a Muslim. And so the ulama were kind of the police force that didn't enforce a single monochromatic thing, because that's impossible, but they did discourage excesses. So if you look at, for example, the Ma'yar of Al-Waran Sharisi, a local figure, many of them are about, he assumes lots of practices that aren't exactly, that you're not going to find in the Sunnah, but some things are just too much. And he says that these have to be stopped. So somebody will give him a fatwa and say, what about this or that? And playing music to get rid of possession of spirit, to get rid of possession of jinn, and no, that's going too far. Right? And we can find this, the ulama producing reams of literature, not insisting that everything, as Ibn Taymiyyah does, insisting that everything be like it was in the first Islamic century, but saying this thing is too far. My favorite example of this is a guy called Haji Shariatullah, who goes to Mecca and Medina from India, and he comes back and spends the rest of his life in Bengal. Now, Bengal was Muslim. All of the people there would have said, or most of the people there, a lot of, perhaps the majority would have said, were Muslim. But even the Qadis did not know how to say, La ilaha illallah. Right? And people did all sorts of things, thinking that this was either Islamic or acceptable from a Muslim point of view, and it wasn't. So, for example, it's hot there, and especially falahin, the equivalent in India, dressed very, let's say, informally. So just a towel sort of around their middle. Yeah, exactly, a dhoti. But he says the dhoti has to, he says, no, that this is unacceptable when you pray. That the wrap has to extend from above the navel to below the knees when you're praying. Right? So this local practice, which everybody thinks is just fine, he comes in some ways a stranger, although he was a Bengali, but coming back from 20 years in Mecca, and he says, no, this won't work, you can't do this. This is outside the boundaries. Right? Similarly, Muslims on the Feast of Sacrifice found themselves in a dilemma. On the one hand, the normative thing to sacrifice, of course, is a sheep or something like that, a goat or something like that. And those are just not things that you'll find in Bengal. It's not a suitable climate for them. They don't exist. The logical thing to sacrifice is a cow, but of course there is this view that cows are somehow sacred animals. Even though the Muslims are no longer Hindus, it's still in the air. It's still part of, you might say, the local dialect understanding. And he says, no, the sacrifice is obligatory. If you can't get a sheep or a goat, then sacrifice a cow. Now, the problem is this, the problem is a political one, which is that the Hindus, who particularly under the British were becoming the landlords, powerful tax collectors and landlords and things, the Hindus, of course, objected to this, So this is really a beginning of Hindu-Muslim conflict in Bengal, because the Muslims say, look, we have an obligation to perform the qurban, the sacrifice, and the Hindus are saying, you're not going to do it with cows, that's for sure, and so we get riots and counter-riots and all of that, which, serve certain interests. All right. Okay, so the Cosmopolitan Islam then creates norms that can be used to discipline and officials who can police the extremes of dialect Islam. And the outcome of this, of course, is that, again, the tendency to vociferate, which, to repeat, is a tendency that we find in all religions over time, is restrained because of this net of scholarship that, sort of checks the boundaries, limits the behaviors at the extreme ends of things, and pulls people back toward the center, right? And this is a particularly important feature because it guarantees that the things that I think are at the center of Islamic practice remain at the center of Islamic practice. So Haji Shariatullah also begins enforcing prayer 5 times a day. And this was, again, not something people did. They knew that, particularly on the Eids, that they should pray together, and people would pray together in the mosque as things happened. But the idea that you ought to pray, and you ought to pray communally, and you ought to pray communally at certain times, was just not known. Or at least it wasn't taken seriously. And Haji Shariatullah and his followers then pushed Muslims to do these things that then allow Bengali Muslims to see themselves in, let's say, Lahori Muslims and vice versa. Because if someone shows up in Lahore and says, I'm a Muslim, but doesn't know how to pray, right, they aren't recognized as a Muslim. Right? And so this is what cosmopolitan Muslims do. And the rubric for this, of course, is al-amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. Right? This is part of the culture of the ulama. It is their job to point out shortcomings. And yet, and here's the but, the reality is, of course, that the ulama themselves live in the same world that everybody else lives in. It's impossible, for example, to talk to their wives and children, let's say, in Arabic if they're living in Khorasan. It's just not the language, in the same way that you can't not use French if you're living in France. You simply have to use French. So every scholar and judge exists in time and space. He lives in locale, broadly speaking, right, conceptually. And the other thing to point out is that there is no single Islamic view on many topics. So again, the example that I used the other day of a young man from a village who went to the Yusufiyya and came back and told people in the village that the dhikrs that were being practiced for the particular tariqah that was there, those were un-Islamic, they were bid'ah. But there were other ulama who said, no, these are not bid'ah, this is piety, this is a form of taqwa, it's a form of cultivating God consciousness and of remembering, dhikr, right, God's presence, and it's a good thing. And so it's important to recognize that there is no single alim position on many of the practices of Muslims that might not necessarily be found directly in the Sunnah, right? Much less, or I say more particularly, we know that on issues of eating, for example, that Muslim scholars accommodated local foods. So the famous example is Shafi'i. The Maliki and Hanafi madhabs say that you can't eat a horse. But in Cairo, where Shafi'i found himself at the end of his career, a horse was evidently a regularly eaten thing. And so he says that it's mubah instead of makruh. Right? And similarly, all throughout Islamdom, there are foods that are not mentioned in the Sunnah and that have to be ruled upon on whether they are mubah or makruh or something like that. A good example is coffee. For 200 years, a battle raged among the ulama about whether you could drink qahwa. Now, on the one hand, qahwa is, the very word is an old word for, obscure word for wine. Well, if it's named qahwa, it's the same as wine. Right. So the point is that coffee alters consciousness. Now, is all alteration of consciousness unacceptable? Right? Because one definition of what wine is, it's الذي خمر العقل. Right? So does coffee becloud the intellect? Well, sure. You know, if you drink a lot of coffee, you become a very irritable person. You don't want to hang around a person who's had 20 cups of coffee, right? So this was a debate in the Ottoman world and fiercely fought. And ulama sometimes closed down coffee houses, and other times the ulama sponsored coffee houses, because the flip side of coffee is that it can keep you awake so you can study. It can keep you awake when you're doing devotions, you know, night devotions in a mosque, and so on. So in the end, it was decided that coffee was acceptable. Similarly, it was and this perhaps is regrettable, but it was accepted that tobacco was acceptable, right? Again, tobacco was debated for 300 years or so. But in the end, it was accepted that tobacco was mubah, although in the late 20th century and into the 21st century, you're now getting ulama who say that it's a form of self-harm, and so it's makruh to smoke a cigarette. Right? So this taking for granted, you know, the local foods and local cultures and local practices, in reality, the ulama are fully embedded in the normal world. They don't live all their time in this kind of special world of the companions. So, for all of these reasons, then, what we find is that the ulama, too, are embedded in their own culture. And the way that they understand the norms of ilm are shaped by the world in which they live. Right? And again, I can give many examples, and you're familiar with these too. There were ulama, for example, among the Wahhabis, who banned, and also on the Yan Tatsine in Nigeria, who banned mirrors. Because mirrors give you an image, and then you could have idolatry. Right? This becomes a sanam. The telegraph was banned because it was a bid'ah, and so on. So the railroad also, you know, the Prophet only traveled on animals or vehicles that were pulled by animals. There's no animal involved in a train, therefore Muslims should not ride on trains, and so on and so forth. And again, this reactionary resistance to change in religious terms is not unique to Muslims by any means. There are similar stories for every tradition that you care to name. But the way it functioned was particular, the way it functioned in Islam was particular to Islam, right? And the arguments that were used and the reasoning that was used and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, the ulama accommodated themselves to their own culture. And that's certainly true now, right? Ulama, in some places, are employees of the state. In other places, they are independent experts. That makes a big difference in how you respond to, various questions about activity and permissibility and so on and so forth, right? And so I gave you I want to leave some time for discussion here, but I gave you the Ibn Battuta readings, which I hope you had a chance to look at. Because for me, this was one of the triggers that made me think about how this actually works. I had a view of the ulama or the experts, and that's what Islam is. But here is Ibn Battuta, who, okay, again, I think we know from the one biographical account of him, he wasn't taken all that serious. He wasn't a great scholar by Moroccan standards. But again, he traveled to places where he seemed like a great scholar, and one of them was he traveled down to what we would call Mauritania and Mali. And there, as you'll recall, he found himself hanging out with other scholars, and yet they behaved in ways that he found amazing and also appalling. So, what do we learn from this story? Right? On the one hand, we learn how ulama operated by shunning. Right? This local scholar was, Ibn Taymiyyah refused to deal with him because he thought he was such a fool. On the other hand, he has to admit that this culture of Muslims is in many ways perfectly Islamic. They pray, they fast, but they use different inheritance rules. Right? They have different rules for how men and women live with each other. Both, whatever he may say, Ibn Battuta and Yang Tagin, I think is his name, are scholars. They're both trained in ilm, and yet they come to very different conclusions. But the logic that's interesting here is when he says, Ibn Battuta reproaches him and says, "Oh, you know better than to be hanging around with women and let your women have male friends and so on and so forth." And he says, "What? Our women are not like the women of your country." Right? In other words, a relevant factor in deciding how to construct gender relations is what men and women are like here as opposed to Morocco. Of course, what he's implying is not very complimentary to Morocco. The women there can't be trusted, but our women are virtuous. They can be trusted with men and men with women, and nothing bad happens. So this is terribly instructive, it seems to me, of the way lived Islam actually works. It is, of course, there are these standards and the things that you learn in books and so on and so forth, but they always are embedded in persons. And persons are embedded in local environments. So certain kinds of political scientists, for example, think that you know all about a country if you know that they're Muslims as opposed to something else, as Orthodox Christians. But for students of Islam, the fact is that you don't know very much about a country from the fact that, or its people from the fact that they're Muslims. Because the way that they're Muslims, the way that Bosnians are Muslims, for example, as opposed to the way that Emiratis are Muslims, are profound and profoundly affect the people's expectations of how they should behave and how they relate to other people. So I guess sort of to offer some sort of summary of all of this, standard Islam is like standard English. It is the Islam of textbooks and courses on Islam. And you'll remember that I pointed out at the very beginning that one of the features of the modern world is that more Muslims than ever before learn about Islam, not just from their parents or their uncles and a local alim, but they learn about Islam and what Islam should be from books. This is a new thing. And so that privileges, or seems to privilege, standard Islam. But standard Islam in reality is no one's native religion, any more than anybody speaks standard English. Nobody speaks standard English. Religious life always involves choices, and those choices are governed in part by context. Not entirely. People can make choices against their context. When someone converts to Islam in the United States, right, that's a challenging thing to do because it, at least initially, moves you in directions that are countercultural. And also it means that people, again, a student of mine who converted to Islam, her parents just refused to talk to her, right? So it's not to say that anybody's life is governed entirely by their context. You can decide to act against the context. But by and large, people live in the world, right? It is lived Islam that I'm interested in, not a theoretical Islam. I'm interested in Islam as we see it in the world. So all of this is to say that what it seems like at first a puzzle, which is the observable varieties of Islam and yet the coherence of Muslims, is resolved when we think of these three aspects of Islam that I've called dialect, koine, and cosmopolitan Islam, when we consider them all together, right? Dialect Islam is part of everyone's Islam, right, to varying degrees. And those dialect practices are the things that other Muslims might be surprised at. Like, for example, hanging out with female friends in the 15th century in Mali. It is in ritual, which is the koine of Islam, as well as certain shared concepts, that Muslims recognize each other, but the uptake and appropriation of those concepts is determined by their context, by their locale, but locale is a metaphor. So the way that professors at a university are Muslims is different from the way that some farmer in a small village in the Middle Atlas is a Muslim. And interestingly enough, again, I've sort of teased this out, even what kind of profession you have predicts to some extent what kind of religion that you'll be interested in, whether you're a biologist or an engineer, whether you're a writer or a pilot will have some allows us to predict to some extent the kind of religious life you'll lead. Official Islam or standard Islam is an artificial construct because that too is always locally inflected. And so if I just teach my students, the 5 pillars and Sharia and Sunnah and Quran and so on and so forth, that's an inadequate representation of the Islam that they're going to find from their Muslim friends in America or from Muslims that they meet if they come to Morocco or Egypt or Uzbekistan. So just as school teachers set the boundaries and norms of religion, and they say, no, you can't write that, or you have to write the accusative there, or something like that, so too professional Muslims set the boundaries for Islamic practice. Increasingly, however, and this is perhaps to me a slightly disturbing fact, increasingly in the modern world, the shaping of Islam is done not just by scholars, but by media figures and influencers. Civil engineer or a television entertainer, or in one case a football player, a famous football player. These become people that define people's Islam, that become models of Islam in the modern world. But there are no essences, right? Essences are a metaphysical concept. They don't exist in reality. Every feature of Islamic religious practice is, here or there, complicated by local concerns. And that makes, these complications are what makes Islam relevant in diverse circumstances. So African Americans find Islam relevant in Chicago. Presumably Muslims find Islam relevant in Morocco, and around the world it goes. This is the situation in which we find ourselves. So if not everyone is interested in lived Islam, many people simply want to know the ideals or the general principles or whatever, and that's fine. But if you're interested in how Islam actually works on the ground, how Muslims actually undertake and live their Islam, this, I would suggest, gives you a set of tools to talk about that. But that requires a certain willingness to, switch positions and examine yourself as if you were coming from somewhere else. In the process, I think it often deepens your commitment or helps you to understand better who you are. That's one of the reasons that, to be honest, that I've spent, something like a third of my life outside of the United States, because I understand myself better, including better as an American, when I go to Uzbekistan or when I go to Indonesia, right? That sharpens the contrast, and I'm able to see clearly the things that I took for granted as natural and normal. To do that in a disciplined way requires scholarly engagement, which requires careful terminology, it requires imagination in some cases, and it requires a certain kind of humane openness, right? And humility. Again, I think of any number of times, starting certainly when I was a senior in high school, where a conversation with somebody who was, usually a Muslim, they said something about America or the United States or Christianity that it was like a light bulb went off. It was like, wow, I never thought of it like that. And as I think about it, it's true. But if my position was, no, Aisha, you don't understand America because you're not an American, then I would have missed those insights that help me understand America much better than I ever would have otherwise. So I invite you to join the world of scholarship. That is to seek a kind of humility, a kind of openness, and a kind of discipline as you think about yourself and about the world and about things you think you know, but that might profit from thinking about them anew. And that is a terribly exciting way to live, although it's a little bit scary sometimes. It's not the most secure way to live, but it leads to a life that at the end is not just a life of, same old, but a life of adventure and growth. So thank you very much.
I'll open the floor to questions or comments, but since I have the privilege of having